Thank you ever so much for inviting me to give this presentation today. It's my honor to be here. I wanted to begin today by talking to you about how I first became interested in this particular subject. When I started to learn German and did an exchange program in Germany, I was sent to the sister school of my university, which was the university in Saarland, in the Saarland. And that is an actual photograph on the side of the student dormitory where we all lived, the international students at the time. And I came over here in Germany for the first time in 1991, and that was shortly around the time when the wall had come down. And there was after the initial euphoria, there was a huge flare up of neo-Nazism in Germany right at the time when I came here. And these are some of the photos of what was going on at the time. It was terrifying to be here in Germany during that period of time as a visible foreigner. I remember walking down the street and there were crowds of Nazis who would walk down the streets as well. I had neo-Nazis who were in my classes as students. I've had students stand up in the middle of presentations and say that they were not going to take a class from a nigger. We had students who were writing essays saying that Hitler had the right idea. Unfortunately, he didn't have time to implement it. So it was a terrifying time here, but it was also a time that taught me a lot about hatred and about love and responsibility. I show you a picture of this dormitory because while we were living there, a group of neo-Nazis who were living in the small area where we were, that town was called Dudweiler. A small group of neo-Nazis decided that they wanted to beat up some foreigners on that day. So they went to our dormitory because it was well known in this small village that there were international students who were living there. And their first hurdle then was to find us. So what they did was they broke into the building and then they simply looked at all of the names on the mailboxes and looked to find names that sounded foreign to them. And then when they located one of the names that they thought sounded the most foreign, they simply rang the bell. That student, not knowing who it was, let them in, and they calmly walked up the stairs and rang her front door bell, and she opened the door not knowing who it was. And as soon as she opened the door, I think that there were 4 or 5 neo-Nazis at the time, they descended on her and kicked her and punched her and spit on her. It was horrific. And students, hearing her screams, ran into the halls, and it just turned into an actual war on the floor. And when more international students came to her rescue, the neo-Nazis ran out of our building and disappeared into the town. And a few days later, I remember standing in front of that series of mailboxes, looking at all of the names. And it was the first time that I really became aware of how foreign sounding my name was in this environment. And it was one of the first instances where I became aware of the fact that having a name that others could use to identify you as being different or other could spell the difference between life or death. I think to a certain extent, as a woman, we're very much aware of the fact that our names can have can be associated with heightened vulnerability. That's one of the reasons why women, when they live alone, for example, will hyphenate their names on their mailboxes or in telephone listings. But this was the first time that I realized that hate groups could use names to systematically hunt people down. People who are minorities who live within societies where they are not welcomed, where they feel that they are not welcomed, or they are made to feel that their difference is a liability within their society, one of the first steps that they often will take or be forced to take is to linguistically assimilate. And that means not only adopting the language of the majority organization or community, but it also means changing your name to make it sound as if it passes into the majority community. The belief is, the hope is for many people, when you do this, that you will be able to slide into the majority community and no one will identify you as being different. And that ultimately that will lead to, or give you one more step of the social acceptance with the community and possibly also protection. But as we know, that is not always the case. And there is a high price to pay for that linguistic assimilation. I'm now going to turn to the area of Holocaust research, and I'm going to begin with the name of Hans Josef Maria Grobka. This is a name that not many people know instantly, those who are aware of the Holocaust and what happened during that period. Not everyone responds immediately to the name Grobka in the same way that they would respond to the name Hitler or Himmler. But Grobka had a key role to play during the Holocaust and the engineering of this ferocious tragedy. He started off as a lawyer and a bureaucrat, but one of the things that he was particularly interested in from the very start of his career was names and how names could be used within the society. One of the first writings that he published was on the fact that Jewish members within the European community had systematically changed their names so that they would not be readily identified as being Jewish. And what he did was to write a thesis on this topic very early on in his career as a young lawyer, to say that names change petitions that Jews sent into the government should not be accepted, because that would allow them the opportunity to disguise, as he said, their non-Aryan lineage. And that he also took that another step further, and he said even those Jews who had officially converted to Christianity should not be allowed to change their name, because that would allow them to disguise their ultimate identity within the Christian society. And this was a major break with years, decades, if not centuries of tradition within Europe, which had said that part of the conversion process, whether or not you were becoming Christian and becoming Jewish or Jewish to Christian, part of that celebration in the conversion process was very often to take on a new name. And there were many governments around Europe that readily accepted that if you had converted, that you could also change your name. There was also a long tradition of expecting Jewish members of the society to take on Christian names, because it was considered to be a social affront if you continued to have a name that was different. It was a mark of showing that you wanted to be a part of the society if you changed your name. So Grobka's position on this, saying that Jews were essentially hiding and disguising themselves in order to do something nefarious within the society, was a break. But it was one that proved extremely popular once the Nazis came into power. He switched from simply being a bureaucrat and moved up within the Nazi party and became a high-ranking minister within the interior. And he was one of the persons who was responsible for writing the Nuremberg race laws. That is one of the things that he is most associated with today. And I've given you a picture of the actual book that was published during the time with all of the so-called Rassengesetze, so all of the laws that were developed during the Nazi period to make a distinction for discrimination and ultimately extermination between so-called Aryans and non-Aryans. But what most people don't know is that in addition to his work in engineering the Nuremberg race laws, he was also responsible for establishing the new naming laws that would be used by the Nazi Party to identify, hunt, and then exterminate people of Jewish ancestry. One of the first movements in this direction under the Nazis came in. It was an edict from the 18th of August, 1938. And basically what the edict said was that Jewish children who were born after the date of 1938 would only be allowed to have so-called Jewish names. And to head off the question, what is a Jewish name? We as linguists would know that that entire concept is fraught. What the Nazi Party also did was to produce a list of names that they considered to be Jewish and acceptable for the Jewish community. So all children who were born after 1938 would only be allowed if they were of a Jewish faith or had been identified as being Jewish, to pick from this name list. There were names for male children and there were names for female children that were allowed. And this was not a secret. This was done in the open. Not only was it well advertised within the Reich, it was also well advertised internationally. What I've given you here on the side is an article that appeared in August 1938, and it was the Saturday edition from the Decoder Daily Review in the United States. And in the article, it says, Jewish children born hereafter may receive only the typical Jewish names that the law prescribes. There are 185 of these first names for males and 91 for females. The two lists were published and they are not attractive. They are given here. There were newspapers all over the world that published this edict. Here are other examples of newspapers that carried announcements about this edict that had been issued in the Reich. Here we have in Springfield, Illinois, and in Connecticut, the line for the first Jews in Germany must have names of Jewish origin. In the Springfield Daily, Germany eliminates non-Semitic names for all native Jews. What's important here is that this article was issued by the Associated Press. And as you know, the Associated Press is one of the biggest organs for international journalism at that time as well. So the fact that the story was picked up by the Associated Press meant that it was carried everywhere. Now, there had been other suggestions made. Blobka wasn't the only person who was active in this area of trying to figure out a way to make the Jewish population identify themselves readily within the Reich. One of the people who had been extremely active in advocating for the fact that Jewish residents of Europe should be required to somehow mark themselves linguistically was Julius Streicher. And this is a picture of him on the side. Julius Streicher was just a horrible individual who was one of the people who was so rabid in his anti-Semitic views. He was one of the driving organs of hatred within the Reich, and he did this through his publication Der Stürmer, which is basically the stormer or the assaulter. And this was a publication that appeared everywhere. There were little glass cases that were posted all over towns. Cities large and small had this publication in view, so you didn't even have to buy it. You could simply walk by the local train station or library or hospital. Any public sphere would have a copy of the Stürmer, and within it you could you could actually read everything that was published for that particular week. And one of the most popular topics that he had, over and beyond accusing Jews of every possible horrific crime in the world, was saying that they had to identify themselves, that they were mixing in and killing children, et cetera, and that we had to do something to mark them linguistically because they had become so skilled in hiding themselves within our communities that we could not be safe from them. So every issue had a special section where he would identify Jews who were particularly dangerous within communities. And he was very famous for coming up with new names, nasty names, to call people who were Jewish, and he would attach these epithets to their names and say that we should call all Jews by this name. One of the things that he said, for example, was that we should attach the word, the English translation would be Yid, to the name of every Jewish person, and that should be officially their name. So, given that, I want you to bear that in mind when we think about the edict that then came into play. And that was talking about the affixation of the names Sarah and Israel. Now, this discussion about the use of so-called Jewish names and so-called Aryan names was not something that was new. It was not something that came up during the Nazi period. It was not something that even Globka had invented or latched upon. This was something that was a discussion constantly. And it wasn't simply a discussion outside of the Jewish community. It was also a discussion within the Jewish community. And I've added this in because the last time that I talked about this in another forum, there was some interest in the issue of Zionism. And there was a very famous author during the 1920s and 1930s. His name was, and I'm going to use the English version of his name, Abraham Schwadron. He was born on the 10th of September, 1878 in Galicia, in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He was brilliant, a brilliant scholar. He studied with his uncle, who was a rabbi, and then he went on to the university, and he received not only one degree, but 3 doctoral degrees in chemistry, law, and philosophy. And he was very active within the Jewish community, and said in every form that he was active in that Jews should be proud of their history, and that assimilationism was essentially collective suicide. So he not only established Zionist associations in Europe, but he published a great deal on Zionism within Europe. In 1914, he moved to Austria, and then he also became a soldier in the First World War. That seems also to have been a very pivotal time, not only for him, but many Jews who served within the war. There was a belief, a hope that if they had served within the war and shown their bravery and their patriotism, that there would be some acceptance, some acknowledgement within their communities that yes, they were a part of the community. And then to come back home and to find that that was absolutely not the case was a turning point for many Jews within their communities once they returned home from the horrors of war. And before he emigrated to Israel, where he became a prolific writer and collector, he also published, as I said, extensively here in Europe about Zionism. And this is one of his early publications from 1920. This is the cover of this, it's an actual pamphlet or a small book. Von der Schande eure Namen. So basically he's talking about the shame surrounded by your name. And what he was saying was he thought that it was an absolute travesty that there were so many Jews within Europe who were adopting the names of the countries that they were living in an attempt to hide their Jewish heritage. And so his answer in this pamphlet is to say, make a decision, choose who you are. And he explicitly said, I'm not talking to your run-of-the-mill Jew when I'm saying this. I am talking to people who are Zionists. Make a decision and say to yourself, as of tomorrow, there's no longer going to be a Fritz or a Trude or an Anne or a Jeanette or Rosa, Gabi, Lizzie, Willi, Charles, Eric, Sally, etc. Get rid of these 4 names. All you need to do is open up a Bible and select one of our beautiful names and start your life as a true Zionist. Make a decision. He goes on to say, our collective mark of shame comes from the fact that there's not one iota difference, not one bit of difference between Zionists and the assimilationists when it comes to selecting names for their children. In their effort to partly show their allegiance by partially revealing their identities, some Zionists have given their children double names like Sigbert, Gideon, or Hildegard, Ruth. And then he says, these double names reflect the duplicity of these people's lives. And duplicity means not only that you have a doubling, it means that you are hiding, that you are inauthentic, that you are lying to yourself and to everyone else. I believe many, not all, but many Yiddish names sound ugly to us because they sound Jewish. We hear them with the ear of the anti-Semitic world. If these same names were popular amongst Aryans, and he did use the word Aryan, which I think is incredibly interesting because this was published in 1920, I wager they would not sound so horrid to us. This is part of the discussion that came out when those name lists were issued by the Nazis. Because one of the reactions, it wasn't just that these names were being prescribed. Many in the Jewish community said that these names are horrible. I mean, these are just horrible. We don't want to name our children this. And some people said, "And why don't you want to name your children these?" And well, they don't sound German. What do they sound? Well, they sound. And some people within the Jewish community said, yes, exactly. They sound not just Yiddish, they sound Jewish. This was not an accident. Globka had systematically talked to members of the Jewish community to find out what were some of the traditional Yiddish names that were used. Now, he wasn't doing this because he was trying to be sensitive to the Jewish community. This was a strategy of his to take the argument away from those people who would say that this kind of prescriptive law is unacceptable. If he had gone the route of someone like Julius Streicher and had said, we're going to apply horrible names like Achselschweiß, which means sweaty armpits. There were some anti-Semitic leaders who had said, let's call them all sweaty armpits, and really offensive names. You would have had much more blowback from people who were not within the Aryan community to say, we are not going to do this. And you would have also had resistance from Aryans who have said, you can't possibly do this. This is unacceptable. But the choosing of names that had a certain history then took the wind out of that argumentation. And there is some discussion that list, because there's been a great deal of research to try to figure out where did this list come from. There is some evidence that he did work with some Jewish scholars to find out what were some of the names that had been popular within the Yiddish-speaking community. But the first law then comes into effect, but that leads a gaping hole, because that is only for Jewish children who were born after 1938. The question is, what about all of those people who were born before that date? As you all know, the Jewish population within Europe was thriving. And these are pictures of some of the beautiful synagogues that were in Europe before all hell broke loose and these beautiful works were destroyed. This is a synagogue in Mainz that was destroyed, in Cologne that was destroyed, and also in Leipzig that was destroyed. I give you these pictures because the size, it's not only the beauty, but the size of these buildings says something about the size of the Jewish communities that were thriving before the rise of Nazism. The other problem was there were certain names that were quite popular among the Jewish community, but were also popular among the non-Jewish community. It wasn't as simple as simply saying, well, we'll just say that all Old Testament names are Jewish, because many of those Old Testament names were also very popular in Christian families. And I've given you here this line, not every Joseph is a Joseph. Because there were some people who were saying, well, you know, there were obviously names that are Jewish, like Joseph, but you could not say that then, and you cannot say that now. Think about Joseph Goebbels, Joseph Mengele, Hans Josef Maria Grobka, or also Joseph Lang, who was a Jew who was interned in Dachau and Auschwitz, but luckily survived. So there was an issue of what do we do with all of those Jews who were born before the edict of 1938, who have names that are popular within both the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community? How do we figure out who is Jewish there, and how do we get them to mark their names? And once we do that, then the hunt can begin. Now, what we are often told when we read about Nazism at the time was that Nazis believed that it was quite easy to make a distinction between who was Aryan and who was non-Aryan. All you needed to do was to study the physiognomy, so the architecture of the human body, and you could determine whether or not someone had Jewish ancestry. And they had a lot of scientific, pseudo-scientific theories that they developed at the time to explain the hair color, the skin color, the grade of hair, the height, the shape of the nose, the size of the eyes. They went into schools and taught children how you could pick out a Jew, even if that person had Jewish ancestry several generations back. Doctors were given kits. As you see here, this is a kit that was used where someone's eye colors were tested against these different eye color packets that they had that doctors and nurses would be given. But there was a realization and acceptance and knowledge within the Nazi circles that this was obviously not going to work. One, because it's an absolute fallacy, and it was not possible. So what they did was to say, the one thing that we can do is to check people's names. We simply need to figure out a system to check people's names. And Globka then came up with a solution, and that was, look, we are not going to go into the community and try to find all of the Jews. That is going to be too difficult. What we are going to do is to force the Jews to identify themselves. So in August of 1938, another edict came. In cases where Jews bear forenames other than those allowed, those names that I showed you in the first list, as of the 1st of January 1939, they will be required to adopt a second forename In the case of male persons, that name shall be Israel. In the case of female persons, Sarah. And in some edicts, you'll see Sarah with an H, and sometimes you'll see it without an H. Jews must request in writing their change of name for all legal identifying documents featuring names. Accidental failure to comply would mean that that person would be subject to a financial fine and or 1 month in prison. Refusal to comply would result in 6 months imprisonment. And you all can imagine what imprisonment during the Nazi period meant. That was essentially for many the death penalty. And in addition to that, all Jews were required to register their name change with the local police authority. And who was the head of the police was Heinrich Himmler. So this edict came into place, and obviously there was a great degree of upset, not only the imposition, the audacity, the violation of having someone say what your children's names could be, but there was also that you had to take on this other name to mark yourself as being Jewish as an adult. For some people, this was considered to be a mark of shame, having Sarah or Israel, because these names were not simply neutral. As we know with the anti-Semitism at the period of time, once you marked yourself as being a member of the Jewish community, you had essentially marked yourself as being a member of a hated community. And you had singled yourself out as required by the Nazi Party for ostracization, discrimination, and death. Many people, in response to these edicts, decided that it would be better to take their own lives than to suffer the shame and the indignity of complying with this edict. And this is from a suicide letter that was written by an H. Yastral. She wrote, "This is neither an accidental death, nor do I have a case of melancholy. I no longer want to live in a place where I have no civil rights, where I will be despised and insulted. I want to be buried with the name that my parents gave and bequeathed me, a name which is entirely untarnished. I do not want to have my name defiled with a mark of shame." And that defilement was the inclusion of the name Sarah. "I do not want to have my name defiled with a mark of shame as a petty criminal. Even a murderer is allowed to retain his own name." Those people who did not commit suicide, but who tried to somehow maneuver themselves and their families around these new edicts, did comply for the period that they could, in order to keep themselves safe, because as you saw, the punishments for failure to comply were risking death. They not only had to have the identifier of Israel or Sarah on their personal identification, but they also had to have it on their public identification. Meaning, for example, on public advertisements. This is a sign that was posted outside of a doctor's office. You see here that his name is Dr. Oscar, and then with the compulsory name Israel Hirschberg. And this was required, obviously, not simply because of his Jewish faith, but also being a Jew and being a doctor. He was only permitted during this period of time under Nazi law to only provide medical care to other Jewish residents. If he had only had the name Dr. Oscar Hirschberg, according to the Nazi philosophy, there might be Aryan patients who would accidentally go to this Jewish doctor, and in order to stop that from being the case, this person had to advertise that they had Jewish identity, therefore the addition of the name Israel. Obviously, what this essentially did was to open up these people to further discrimination and violence. And you see here a picture that was taken at the time of Nazis who were posted outside of a Woolworths that was owned by a Jewish family, telling the passersby that they were not to enter into this store. It was very easy for the Nazis then in every town to identify what was a Jewish-owned business or organization once this edict came into play that Sarah and Israel had to be displayed. And these names had to be displayed everywhere. So not only on places of business, but also where people resided in their private residences. There were some cities that went so far as to say that even on the gravestones, that the gravestones of the dead had to then be changed so that Israel and Sarah appeared as second names on gravestones. And then obviously those were the gravestones that were immediately defiled. So I've given you a picture here, September 1st, 1941, of Jewish residents within the city who are wearing the compulsory yellow star with the word Judah written, Jew written in the center of the star. As you can see, this edict came down after the implementation of the name laws by the Nazis. And I think it's really important to mention not only that it came first, these laws, but also there was a difference with the Jewish star. Obviously, this is a mark that would allow potential attackers to signal you out. But it was also something that you could potentially hide if you had a scarf. If you saw someone in uniform, you could perhaps put your scarf around the star, or you could strategically place the star so that it was closer to a lapel that you could maybe hide. And there were many people who did try to do this, to hide their star if they were in public and suddenly saw themselves in danger. Obviously, you were already taking a risk if you were doing that, but there was some possibility of doing that. But you cannot hide your name when someone is asking you for your identification papers. Then that name of Israel or Sarah will be there for all to see. As I said, Glupka's strategy was, we are not going to identify them ourselves. We are going to have them do the work for us. Not only that, all of the Jews who were required to request, and you really have to, imagine, required to request this name change, also had to pay for that request. So it was ingenious in that it also garnered incredible revenue for the Nazi Party in making the victims pay for their own victimization. That is the level of the perversion that we are seeing. And if you go into the National Archives, you will see letter after letter after letter of Jewish residents requesting, upon literal pain of death, that their name be changed to have Sarah and Israel added. So not only were they then making this request themselves, paying for this request, but they were also then registering themselves as having Jewish heritage, which made it that much easier for the Nazis to identify and murder them. You see here two identification cards for Jewish residents. With the young lady, her first name is Margaret, and then immediately afterwards, you see the compulsory name of Sarah. There's the giant red stamp of J for Judah, which means Jewish, which was also on the passport, but not all passports had the J. Some of them did, and some of them didn't. Obviously, as the Nazis became more powerful and the punishments for not having the J, also for Aryan administrators was imposed, that became more common. But what you see on all of these passports is Sarah or Israel. As you see in the second passport, the person's first name is Fritz Adolf, and the compulsory second name is Israel. These name lists then were also used by companies, public and private, to identify people who had Jewish heritage. So this is a report that was sent by a company in Mainz am Rhein. Companies large and small, public and private, were required to go through all of their records and to identify all of the employees who had Jewish heritage. And this was very easily done because in order to work for a company, you had to show them your identifying documentation, which meant that the company then saw that your second name listed was Sarah or Israel. They then made their internal lists and they sent those internal lists to the Nazi Party. And they had to regularly send in these lists of all of their Jewish employees. And we see here that they have a list of those employees. They've given the employee number, the surname of the employee, their first initial, and then that racial marker of Israel. And you can see here the first person who has the employment number 2022. And then after the surname and the first initial P, you have the term Israel. And then subsequent to that underneath, the two quotation marks mean this is also another Jewish person with the name Israel. And the line above says, these are the Jews who are working in our company. Those lists, and these lists, as I said, were compiled all over the Reich, public and in private organizations, were then used by the Nazi authorities to compile other lists, and those other lists were used to compile deportation lists. And even on the deportation list, we see again the name Israel and Sarah, Israel and Sarah, Israel and Sarah. So what happened after the war, the end of World War II? A new start, a new beginning. Unfortunately, that new beginning within German society also included in the 1950s many of the Nazis who had been very active in the mass murder of the Jews, including Glöcke, who became the first Secretary of State. Absolutely incredible that the decision was made. And he remained Secretary of State for many years. This is unfortunately not only a story of the past. Many of you know that there is a fascist party within Germany that's called Alternative für Deutschland, AfD. You can see their insignia or logo. In the beginning, when the party started, it was particularly popular in the east of Germany, and there were many who said, well, this is just going to be an East German phenomenon, but this isn't going to catch on. Well, unfortunately, it has, and they are now a part of the parliament. One of the first things that many of the small parties have done throughout Germany is to require the government create lists of people, people who are gay, people who are visible minorities, people who are Jews. Because they are an official party within the government has been required by law to provide these lists to this fascist organization. And this is a response of a parliamentarian who's not a member of the AfD, who was horrified that they were asking for this list of names. And he said in the middle of the parliamentary session, what is the meaning of asking for the names? What in God's name are you trying to achieve with this request? What are you going to do with the names? This is a map of Germany showing where the AfD is active. And you can see that this is not simply an Eastern phenomenon. But the issue of using names in order to target people for mass destruction is something that sadly we have seen repeated. For example, in Rwanda, we have seen people segregating and identifying others for victimization and mass murder. This is a quote from someone who survived the genocide of Rwanda in 1994. And he said, essentially, you know, we can all talk about the semantics of this forever and a day, but at the end of the day, the question is, why did people come to my house looking for me? And I can tell you why. And it was because my name was on a list of people who were to be killed. Srebrenica in 1995, we saw again the systematic use of people's names in order to identify those who would be murdered. This is a quote from an article that was written on July 12th, 2020, to mark the anniversary of this tragedy. And the journalist wrote, the systematic expulsion and murder of people with Muslim names in Bosnia-Herzegovina began as early as 1992 and was the result of years of organized, media-controlled hostility towards Muslims, driven by the right-wing radicals who had come to power. Again, the use of nameless. And today, we are seeing, again, people's names being drawn on lists for them to be separated, ostracized, and murdered. The Russians are hunting us down. They had a list of our names. So I want to end, because I know that there is some discussion about talking about other events, other acts of genocide, when you speak about the Holocaust. I do not say that in order to relativize the Holocaust. The Shoah is an incomparable event. I say that simply because we have a moral responsibility in the memory and in love for those who lost their lives to make sure that we do everything in our power to see that it never happens again and to stop genocide before it starts. Thank you very much.